Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host, Vikas Varun. One of the cardinal doctrines of India's foreign policy is neighborhood first. There is a recognition that neighbors have a first claim on India. And among those neighbors, one of the most important is Sri Lanka, with which we have civilizational links and a shared legacy of historical, cultural, spiritual, religious, and linguistic ties dating back more than 2,500 years. The modern partnership between the two countries covers a whole range of sectors, from development to defense, commerce to culture, education to energy. The 26-year-old civil war ended in Sri Lanka in 2009, and India has consistently emphasized the need for national reconciliation and a political settlement of the ethnic issue, which allows all citizens, including the Sri Lankan Tamil community, to live a life of equality, justice, peace, and dignity in a united Sri Lanka. India has traditionally been among Sri Lanka's largest trade partners, with merchandise trade amounting to $3.6 billion in 2020. Sri Lankan exports to India have increased substantially since 2000, when the India-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement came into force. In addition to being Sri Lanka's second largest trade partner, India is also one of the largest contributors to foreign direct investment in Sri Lanka, having invested about $1.7 billion during the period 2005 to 2019 in areas such as petroleum retail, tourism and hotel, telecommunications, real estate, manufacturing, banking and financial services. In September last year, India's Adani Group signed a $700 million deal to develop and run the strategic Colombo Port's West Container Terminal. And in January this year, Indian oil subsidiary Lanka IOC was given 49% stake in the joint development of the Trincomalee oil tank farm. More Indian investments are due to follow in renewable energy, infrastructure and power. Similarly, investments by Sri Lankan companies in India are also surging, taking advantage of India's dynamic economy and wider market. Significant examples include Brandix, which has invested about $1 billion to set up a garment city in Visakhapatnam, MAS Holdings, Damro, LTL Holdings, and other investments in the freight servicing and logistics sector. Pre-pandemic, tourism was also booming, with a record 355,000 Indian tourists visiting the island nation in 2019, now the single largest source of tourism. Development cooperation is an important pillar of the relationship, with the Indian government committing more than $4 billion, including lines of credit and grant projects in sectors such as education, health, livelihood, housing and industrial development. The developmental assistance projects for internally displaced persons and disadvantaged sections of the population in Sri Lanka, grant of 5 lakh COVID-19 vaccines to Sri Lanka as part of India's Vaccine Maitri initiative, and the very recent $500 million line of credit for urgent fuel imports on top of the $900 million relief to Sri Lanka, facing one of its worst economic downturns, have helped further cement the bonds of friendship between the two countries. To learn more about the special relationship between India and Sri Lanka, I am joined by a very special guest, Sri Lanka's Foreign Minister, His Excellency Professor Gamani Lakshman Peres. Professor Peres has been in politics and governance for nearly 3 decades, having first become a Member of Parliament in 1994. Prior to joining politics, Professor Peres had 25 years of academic and administrative experience in the higher education sector, having held the position of Vice Chancellor at the University of Colombo. Professor Peres was also a Rhodes Scholar and Quondam Visiting Fellow at Of All Souls College, University of Oxford. He has held multiple ministerial portfolios, serving previously as Minister of Education, Minister of Export Development and International Trade, Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, Minister of Ethnic Affairs and National Integration, Minister of Enterprise Development, Investment Promotion and Industrial Policy, and Deputy Minister of Finance. It is a pleasure to have you with us, Professor Peres. Thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. As Foreign Minister, what would you say are the top priorities, the top foreign policy priorities of your government?
One of our top foreign policy priorities is to ensure an accurate understanding of Sri Lanka, its challenges, its responses, the progress that it has made, not through the prism of bias or interests and the fortunes and politics elsewhere, but to be fair-minded in an evaluation of the manner in which Sri Lanka has dealt with its problems. And also we have 66 foreign missions We have told each of them that their objective this year is economic diplomacy. That is our principal objective, to ensure the development of investment, trade, tourism. That is non-debt foreign inflows. That is what the country needs at this moment. And we want all our foreign missions to act energetically in order to promote that kind of inflows into the country.
You had very extensive discussions with India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar. Could you brief us on the broad outcomes?
Yeah, the broad outcome is, first of all, the recognition that our relationship is undergoing a basic transformation between Sri Lanka and India, but it is now being elevated to the level of a strategic partnership, collaborating in almost every major sector of economic activity. The Trincomalee oil tank farms, that gives us enormous opportunities for collaboration in respect of oil, petroleum, gas, and so on. The storage facility which India has, and for Sri Lanka the advantage is energy security investment. Take the electricity sector, that is a major requirement of Sri Lanka. Our own Ceylon Electricity Board can produce only about 4,300 megawatts of power, but NTPC alone in India more than 60,000 megawatts. Then we have the capacity for the development of wind power in the Mana area of Sri Lanka, approximately 5,000 megawatts of power. In all these sectors we can work together, and as far as Sri Lanka's requirement of oil is concerned, India is the third largest consumer of oil in the world, and India's requirement will grow by about 40-45% by 2030. So clearly Sri Lanka working with India will be in a far better position to obtain our oil resources at more competitive prices. So in all these areas, working together, greater integration between the two countries is what we are aiming at, and practical ways and means, modalities of achieving this objective was one of the principal themes of the discussion with His Excellency Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar this morning.
Your visit comes at a time when Sri Lanka is facing a severe economic crisis. How did this happen, and what is India doing to help Sri Lanka at this important time?
Well, it happened because of the combination of several factors. The collapse of the tourism industry, it was nobody's fault. It was the inevitable result of COVID-19. But it's an industry that is worth more than 5 billion, about 5.1 billion US dollars for our country, which for an economy of Sri Lanka's size is very significant. Then the remittances of Sri Lankans working abroad, those of the tourism almost dried up. The remittances were greatly diminished, because the overwhelming majority of Sri Lankan expatriates naturally wanted to come home when they were ill. We facilitated that. It resulted in a greater reduction of the money they were sending to the Sri Lankan exchequer. Our exports, fortunately, were not very badly affected. So the combination of all this was quite a severe foreign exchange crisis. India helped immensely to tide over this crisis, and there was a comprehensive package of support that was successfully negotiated by my colleague, the Honorable Basil Rajapaksa, Minister of Finance, as you know, who was here a few weeks ago. The package consisted of several pillars, one of which was a credit line of 1 billion US dollars for the purchase of food items, pharmaceutical products, and so on. Then a $500 million revolving credit made available to us by the Exim Bank of India for the purchase of oil, one of our principal requirements. Then Indian support for our balance of payments, 400 million SARC currency swap agreement, and a deferral of about 515 million US dollars for the Asian Clearing Union. The fourth pillar was a significant infusion of Indian capital from the private sector into key sectors of Sri Lanka's economy. All of this helped us to tide over this crisis. But we're already finding our way out of the woods because the tourists are coming back, about 35,000, 40,000 a day. The Sri Lankan workers have gone back and are sending their remittances. But at the worst of times, India stood by us as a friend, an ally, as a trusted associate of our country.
Over the years, there has been a perception in New Delhi that Sri Lanka has drifted towards China for economic support and views it as a more reliable partner in enabling domestic economic development. The cancellation of the deal to give India the East Container Terminal at Colombo Port further fueled this perception. There has also been a lot of commentary that Beijing has lured Colombo into a debt trap. How do you respond to this?
You know, that whole idea of a debt trap is a fiction. There was no such thing. We did obtain loans from China, and the Belt and Road Initiative did entail benefit for Sri Lanka. There's no gainsaying that. Every country obtains loans for economic development. If you don't obtain loans, you remain stagnant. The problem is not about obtaining loans, but about the manner in which each loan is structured. It must be viable. You take the loan for something productive, to create an asset that will produce income, and out of that income you will repay the loan. Now, that is how Sri Lanka structured its loans. Take, for example, the loan that was obtained to create a port in the deep south of the country. Don't forget, the major sea lanes of the world are just 20 nautical miles off the south coast of Sri Lanka. 60,000 ships pass that way every year, and 1/3 of the world's oil supplies. So it made sense to build a port there. We used Chinese resources. At the time the government changed in 2015 and we were voted out of office, a substantial amount of the loan which had been obtained had in fact been repaid. But what happened next? The government that came in used those assets cynically in such a way as to disrupt all the plans that have been carefully made for the repayment of the loans. A horrendous example is Mattala International Airport, which was used for the storage of paddy. A fully fledged, fully equipped international airport used for the storage of paddy. So these are the things that disrupted the careful plans which had been made for the repayment of these loans. There was never a risk that we would not be able to repay our loans and that debt would have to be converted into equity. It was never going to happen in Sri Lanka, and this whole notion of a debt trap is therefore not in accordance with the facts at all.
As you mentioned, the deal on the Trincomalee oil farms and the Colombo West International Container Terminal are significant milestones in the economic partnership between India and Sri Lanka. What more can be done to boost the economic and investment partnership between the two countries?
They are significant because they are so visible, right? But they are not the only areas in which collaboration is possible and represent a win-win situation for both countries. Take the pharmaceutical sector. We have begun producing pharmaceuticals, saline for instance. We save a lot of foreign exchange. And there's also a market for some of the medicines that we are producing in Sri Lanka in other countries. Now, there are 3 investment zones which we have established in the country for the production of pharmaceuticals. Now, Indian companies would like to invest and they're most welcome to do so. Now, I told you about ports and harbors. We want to develop Colombo and Hambantota as transshipment hubs, transshipment, right? We want them to be digital hubs, knowledge hubs, manufacturing hubs. But 70% of the traffic is India bound. Container shipping, 70% is linked to India. And much of it with Adani held ports. Now, Adani is active in the West Container Terminal. The dredging operations are due to begin within the next few months. So, obviously, it makes sense for us to work towards greater integration with regard to the development of our ports and harbors. So in all these areas, electricity, ports and harbors, oil and gas, tourism, As you said, more than 1/3 of the tourists coming into Sri Lanka are from India. Now look at the Ramayana trail. It is romantic, it takes us back into the past, and there is a lot of scope for Indian investment into the hospitality sector. Already ITC is there, Taj hotels are there.
Foreign Minister, given the proximity of territorial waters of both countries, especially in the Pork Straits and the Gulf of Mannar, incidents of fishermen of either side inadvertently crossing the international maritime boundary line are common, and this has become a major irritant in bilateral ties. What is being done to find a long-term solution to this issue?
Yes, I agree with you. It's a major irritant. It's also a constant irritant. It keeps happening all the time. And it is a flashpoint. I would say that is the only fly in the ointment, as it were, in what is otherwise a uniformly positive relationship between the two countries. We really must find a solution to this. Because what we are now doing is when a crisis occurs, the arrest of Indian fishermen and boats and Sri Lankan fishermen and boats on this side, we deal with that immediate crisis, but then in 10 days' time it happens again. Various ideas have been discussed in the past. This is by no means a new problem. This has been with us for decades. Some of the ideas which have emerged from the discussions held so far are Indian investment into training for fishermen to go out into the deep sea, to entice them away from the shallow waters. Then there has also been an interesting suggestion about involving the cooperative societies of fishermen on both sides. Then Indian support for fisheries harbours in the north. All these are useful suggestions, but they are not going to provide us with an immediate or a short-term solution. We are planning some high-level discussions in Colombo involving not just the foreign ministers of the two countries, but also the fisheries ministers. All I can say is that it's a long-standing problem. It's a problem that is crying out for solution, and there is now a sharp focus on the part of both governments and a firm resolve to come up with practical modalities directed towards a solution. And this will happen soon as a matter of priority. We want to take this in hand and sort this out.
Last year, at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, a resolution piloted by the United States and several other Western countries was passed, giving United Nations Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet a mandate to collect evidence of crimes during Sri Lanka's long civil war against the LTTE. Now I know that Sri Lanka has rejected the resolution, but what is being done to bridge the trust deficit with the West?
What we are doing to bridge the trust deficit is we are engaging with them. And we are trying to convince them that this is not the way to go about it. Oral updates, written reports, special mechanisms targeting Sri Lanka, singling out one country, right? Spending millions and millions of dollars in pursuing Sri Lanka, when half the world is struggling for access to life-saving vaccines. And, look at this objectively. What are the trouble spots in the world today? Is Sri Lanka a problem for anybody? Is there any sense of proportion in this? The amount of time, energy and resources being devoted to Sri Lanka, does it make any sense when you consider the very volatile situations in other parts of the world? So we want to engage with countries that are moving these resolutions to say, let's work together in a spirit of partnership, not polarization. Resolutions, votes in the UN, who is for, who is against, who is in the middle. There is a sense of fatigue. Countries are tired of this. And many countries are telling us this is acutely embarrassing. We have nothing against Sri Lanka. We don't want to be forced to vote for or against. So I want to address the countries in question in a spirit of candor and say, look at the progress which has been made in an exceedingly difficult situation. Look at the work which has been done by local mechanisms operating on the ground in Sri Lanka. the Office of Missing Persons, the Office of Reparations, the Office of National Unity and Reconciliation. Solutions have to be evolved in consonance with local cultural aspirations and circumstances. I mean, there's no size that fits everybody. So you can't evolve some kind of supposed panacea in Geneva and expect it to work all over the world. That's not the way to set about it. So this is the approach that I want to take in Geneva. And I must say that addressing diplomatic missions in Colombo and elsewhere, it seems to me that that approach is gaining considerable resonance.
Recently, prominent Tamil political parties of Sri Lanka wrote to Prime Minister Narendra Modi seeking India's intervention in ensuring a durable political solution to the island's long-pending Tamil question. Can we expect any forward movement on full implementation of the 13th Amendment and holding of provincial council elections in the north and east?
On the holding of provincial council elections, provincial councils have not been held for 2 years. Who created that situation? One of the largest contributors to that was none other than the Tamil National Alliance, because they collaborated with the previous government to bring about this situation. Elections were being held regularly. Under the previous administration of President Mahinda Rajapaksa, where I served as Foreign Minister from 2010 to 2015, we held elections on time. In fact, before the date scheduled for the conduct of elections. But the last government, because they were convinced that they would lose, tried to find a devious way of not holding these elections. And the ingenious remedy that they thought of was to abolish the existing electoral system and not replace it with any substitute. And then argue there is a lacuna, they can't hold elections were never held. Now the previous government did not have the votes to do this. The Tamil National Alliance at that time had 16 seats in Parliament, and they used all 16 votes to help the previous government to achieve their objective of suspending elections indefinitely. And that is the situation that is now continuing. So it seems to me ironical for a party which directly created this situation, much to the detriment of the people that they are supposed to represent, having created that situation, now to go to foreign governments and exhort foreign governments to step in and find a solution. It seems to me ironical. On the other question that you put to me, there is now an experts committee which is drafting or preparing the first draft of a complete constitution, not just one part of it or the other. That work is expected to be completed within the next 2 or 3 months. It will then be submitted to the government. It will go through the parliamentary process, and the 13th Amendment, devolution of power. These will all be addressed as part of an overall exercise in constitutional reform. After all, the present constitution is almost half a century old. It needs to be revisited. That is being done.
Buddhism provides a huge connect between the two countries. India recently announced a $15 million grant for promotion of bilateral Buddhist ties, and Prime Minister Modi personally received an inaugural international flight carrying Sri Lankan pilgrims to the sacred city of Kushinagar. How can we jointly develop this shared Buddhist heritage?
I think that is the strongest link. This is not just a relationship confined to the corridors of power in New Delhi and Colombo. It has to do with the hearts and minds of people, a sense of affinity, of closeness, which is felt by people on both sides, and the Buddhist heritage. Buddhist monks coming here, pilgrims coming all the time. And India is offering support of all kinds in collaboration with the government of Sri Lanka. So Buddhism is certainly India's greatest gift to Sri Lanka, and we must do everything possible to build on that in order to make the relationship come alive in the hearts and minds of people on both sides of the Pork Strait. One of the strongest ingredients of the bilateral relationship.
Not many people are aware that Sri Lanka had a special place in the heart of Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore, who visited Sri Lanka 3 times in 1922, 1928 and 1934. The third visit of Gurudev is remembered for the foundation of Sri Pali on the lines of Shantiniketan. And your family had a personal connection to Tagore because the invitation for this visit was extended by none other than your granduncle, Mr. Wilmot A. Pereira. So how does the legacy of Tagore continue to live on in Sri Lanka?
It lives on in this way. Just 3 or 4 days ago, I went to Sri Pali with the Indian High Commissioner in Sri Lanka, His Excellency Gopal Bagle, to unveil a bust of Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore. That was a gift by the Government of India. His main legacy is this, that no culture has a monopoly of wisdom. There isn't just one culture which is superior to every other culture, and Tagore was one of the most persuasive protagonists of that view. He was very proud of his own culture. He belongs not just to India or to Asia, but indeed to the whole world. He was a beacon light which projected to the world at large the intrinsic merits, the inherent worth of Eastern culture. So that is what will live on. And that is why Wilmot A. Pereira, my granduncle, when he visited Shantiniketan in 1932, he was so impressed that he used his own ancestral property for the construction of Sri Pali. Tagore laid the foundation stone with his own hands, and the name Sri Pali was suggested by Tagore himself. And as a teenager, as a schoolboy, I remember going to Sri Pali with my granduncle, listening to lectures of Indian leaders of the caliber of Dr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. There's a beautiful photograph of Radhakrishnan, Wilmot Pereira sitting out in the garden. Radhakrishnan subsequently became a Spalding professor of Eastern religions and ethics in the University of Oxford. And he and I were both fellows of the same college, All Souls College, Oxford. So Wilmot Pereira, I think, rendered human service in that regard. And we are now celebrating the 100th anniversary of Rabindranath Tagore's visit to Sri Lanka.
Final question. You had a brilliant academic career before you joined politics. You have been a professor of law and vice chancellor at the University of Colombo. Do you think your academic background helps your work as foreign minister?
Well, in many ways. I taught in the university for 26 years. So some of my students are now today in very senior positions in the private sector, in government, in the banks, in the legal profession, everywhere. And some of my colleagues and people I associated closely with in foreign universities like Oxford, Cambridge and so on, have been immensely helpful to me in work that I undertook later in life, like the drafting of constitutional provisions for Sri Lanka. I was also the leader of the Sri Lankan government team in direct negotiations with the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. We had discussions with them, 5 discussions in different parts of the world. My counterpart was Anton Balasingham. And there again, the people who had taught me, people who had worked with me, were very helpful in making suggestions, in suggesting strategies, solutions to problems and so on. So it has been a great source of encouragement, working with people who have worked in this field for a whole lifetime. So I wasn't left on my own to carry a burden on my own shoulders, and that has been enormously helpful.
Foreign Minister, thank you so much for sharing these valuable insights with us. It has really enriched our understanding of the modern partnership between India and Sri Lanka. That is all I have for you tonight on this episode of Diplomatic Dispatch. Join me next week for yet another edition. Till then, good evening and goodbye.